What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out, because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project, 1981. We're now about halfway through the horror of 1981, and it's starting to get pretty hot in here. And we're starting to get to the point where I've seen the majority of the movies in the blocks already. But there's still some hidden treasures to be found. And this is true for this block as well, since I've seen most of them, but there's a few that were new. But get ready, because this block is pretty furry. This one kicks off on June 17th in France with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne, which was also released as Dr. Jekyll and His Women. We're introduced to Fanny Osborne, who is announcing her engagement to Dr. Jekyll, here played by the boss of the vampires, Dragon Eddie. They have a big dinner party, and Patrick McGee is here, and damn, he is just showing up all over the place in this year in the project. He's already showed up in The Black Cat, and The Monster Club, and now this. When Jekyll's party finds a young girl killed outside, and then another one dead and assaulted in the upstairs bathroom, the rest of the guests go into high alert. There's then an unseen man tying up the general and having very explicit sex with his daughter. Pretty soon there's a trail of bodies in the house and Jekyll is missing. And this one was a French film directed by Walerian Borowczyk, a Polish director who started off in animation but then moved into making artful erotic tales. It's clearly a take on the classic Jekyll and Hyde tale, but played a little more serious and surreal, and yeah, obviously a bit bawdy, but the transformation is a lot more subtle. But Hyde is definitely a bit more off-putting, and that's kind of a challenge. I would put that down on my acting resume, considered more off-putting than Udo freaking Kier. This one wasn't released in the US until much later on, but opened in France and a few other countries, and was released in the UK, but only ran for 1 week. It got some acclaim when it was released and won several European Film Awards, but didn't reach a great success level commercially, even if it did critically and artistically. And I'm giving this one a 3.5. It takes a while to get going, but once it gets going, whoo boy does it go. It is a weird, wild ride, but I do wish it had some more character stuff and depth to it. Its horror cultural significance is a 2.5 since it's not very well known in the States, although it's more noted overseas, but it contains genre legend Udo Kier and is a take on classic horror tales. Should you watch it? Yeah, but be prepared because it's fairly sexually intense at times.
My dream is to watch you die.
No, I don't believe that, Henry. I recognize you in there. No.
My pleasure is seeing your dead body.
Next up on July 9th in Italy, get ready for Burial Ground, The Nights of Terror, although it wouldn't get a US launch until 1985. It begins with a scientist in this old house and whoops, he unleashes a curse that sets free zombies that eat him. 3 carloads of people all show up at the mansion as they were invited, and it looks and feels like the opening to Patrick Still Lives, which is kind of weird because both films feature Mariangela Giordano. Her son is Michael here, and he's supposed to be a young kid, but he's clearly an adult and is in fact a 25-year-old man. And they eat in this dining hall that I swear also looks like the one from Patrick Still Lives. So I pulled it up to compare, and they seem to not be the same room, but damn are they close. But since I had it pulled up, I went back to the footage of the cars arriving, and would you look at that? It's the same damn place. And you know what? I'm going back to that dining room scene, and these things on the wall are the same. So this is the same room, just with different set dressings. Then they're at this big fountain outside, and yep, also in Patrick. And it's weird because it's not the same director or anything. They just booked the same location and wrote a bunch of similar scenes and then cast the same actress. And if they show the swimming pool from that one, it'll be a slam dunk. Anyway, the zombies start showing up around the property, including this one doing his best Fulci impression, and they start attacking. And this one zombie mask is basically just a distressed Frankenstein monster mask, and I have no clue how these zombies are a threat, given how slow they are. So this one was directed by Andrea Bianchi, who did a handful of wild exploitation flicks around this same time, and he clearly takes some inspiration from other sources and even straight up reproduces the eyeball gag from Zombie 2, and in fact was sold as Zombie 3 in a couple of countries. And I'm not sure if you remember, but when I talked about Patrick Still Lives, I mentioned Giordano's death scene in that one, which was an over-the-top kill in which she had a sword basically run through her body, starting in her bathing suit zone and exiting her mouth. Well, she doesn't get off easy in this one either, since her zombified son chomps off one of her breasts because she decides to breastfeed him. And this one is also a 3.5 for me. It's pretty silly Italian zombie stuff, but there's enough wacky fun going on to make it a good time. I'd rank it a touch higher, but there's just a little too much lag in the middle. Its significance is a touch lower at 2.5, since it was a more frequently encountered box cover back in the day and was just always on that horror shelf and was a part of the whole Italian zombie greatness, but it's not really that well known and doesn't feature any genre vets. Should you watch it? Definitely. It's pretty out there and enjoyable.
Always together. Michael, look at me, Angel. Look at me. Oh, yes, darling.
A little later in the month, on July 24th, back in America, Woofen was released, an adaptation of the Whitley Strieber novel of the same name. It's set in New York City, and on the night of a full moon, a rich man, his wife, and security guard are all killed in the park. Aaron Brockovich's boss is here, and this is the same year Looker came out, and Albert Finney was in that too, and I can't wait to discuss that one on the Sci-Fi Project. He's a cop called in to investigate the murders, and Gregory Hines is here as well, just being awesome as usual. And they start working the case, and there's more killings, and things seem to be centered around a construction site and an abandoned church. He teams up with a psychologist, and their only clues are some hairs, which turn out to be from a wolf. So they go get advice from Francis Dollarhide, which seems like kind of a bad idea, but he's innocent this time. So maybe Admiral Adama is to blame? And like I said, this is based on the Strieber novel, the writer most known for the book Communion, which was also adapted into a movie and was supposed to be a non-fiction book about his own alien abductions. He also wrote The Hunger, which was also adapted into a pretty fantastic film, and this one was adapted and directed by Michael Wadley, who had an interesting career. He directed this movie, and then did one TV movie 11 years later in 1970. But before that was the director of the Oscar-winning Woodstock documentary, and all of the other works that Wadley directed were Woodstock-oriented. And it's crazy because this is 81, right? This is the year of the werewolf. You have American Werewolf and The Howling released in the very same year, and based on the title and some aspects here, that's what you think you're gonna get. But this is no lycanthrope tale. This is something else, and a pretty original concept, even though it gets labeled a werewolf movie at times. Originally, they were trying to get Dustin Hoffman to play the role of Dewey, but Wadley insisted on Albert Finney, and the shoot appears to have been troubled. They went over schedule and way over budget, and the studio was considering firing the director. But after some back and forth, he managed to be able to finish shooting what he needed. That included some reshoots that were needed when their wolf effects didn't work and they needed to find another effects team to come in and redo everything. And in the end, when Wadley turned in his cut, it was reportedly over 4.5 hours. At this point, he was let go. And John D. Hancock, known for Let's Scare Jessica to Death, came on board to supervise the edit and audio sessions to get it down to a reasonable length. And it ended up being a mixed bag. Although the majority of the reviews were pretty favorable, with even the hard-to-please with horror Roger Ebert giving it some praise, it was a dud at the box office. It only made back $10 million of its $17 million budget, and was shortly overshadowed by another Wolf-related feature that we'll discuss in just a little bit. My rating on this one, though, is a 4. Even if it's a touch on the slow side, it's dripping with mood, and I love the themes that it's discussing. It's a little deeper movie than I realized when I saw this when I was younger. Its significance is pretty solid at a 3.5 since it involves some big names with Finney, Hines, Noonan, and Almost, and also featured a very nice early score by James Horner. Plus, it was the first film to use the optical POV process for the wolves that would later be used in a number of other films, including Predator. I can't give it much higher though, since it never made a dent and remains at best a cult film. Should you watch it? That's a yes. I think it's underrated. Going into August now, on the 7th, things got a little wackier with the release of Student Bodies. The beginning sort of immediately lets us know what kind of movie it's going to be, with a series of jokes and puns on screen. Then a comedically heavy breathing stalker. And it's like rapid fire with the gags, so you can bet that some land.
Julie, you're not responding to my maleness.
And some don't. The killer is referred to as Breather and wears rubber gloves and starts the killing. And after he does so, he wraps his victims in trash bags.
She's watching TV.
At 75 cents an hour? We'll see about that.
That's $2.50 an hour today if you account for inflation. I think that's a joke about how cheap she is, but holy crap. And I don't know why this is my favorite joke in the movie, but it is. The dad finds a piece of chicken on the ground, calls it
Broken.
and then fixes it with a rubber band and puts it back in the fridge. The movie gives you an on-screen body count to tally the victims, and we're introduced to our group of high school students and the staff. And it's kind of weird because almost everyone in this movie didn't really do anything else, and that included the Stick. His real name is Patrick Boone Varnell, and this is his only film, although he was in a pilot for a TV show called Out of Control that never aired, and he's unusually tall and lanky and double-jointed with weird contortions, and passed away several years later in 1989.
Student bodies!
This was directed by Mickey Rose, and it's actually the only thing that he helmed, but he had a pretty huge career writing for television, including a long-running stint on The Tonight Show. And when I say long-running, I mean he wrote for 982 episodes.
The Lamar High Marching Band, the finest marching band on this street at this moment.
Now, since Rose was an inexperienced director, the studio assigned Michael Ritchie, director of the Fletch films and The Island, which was on the project for 1980, to be on set and sort of supervise the whole thing. He's not credited on the film though, and there's some dispute as to why. There was a writer's strike going on at the time, and it's said that he chose not to take credit to avoid issues with the union. But Rose was also a part of the WGA and didn't have any problems. So there's those that say that he simply didn't like the finished product and wanted to distance himself from it. Speaking of distance...
I'll get it. I'm farthest from the phone.
That makes sense.
And this was one of the earliest horror spoof movies, and several others would follow pretty shortly after, but this was a disappointment when it came out. It only made $5 million and didn't get such great write-ups, but over time, it's developed a massive cult following, mostly due to repeated cable and TV runs, and is now more kindly regarded. And my rating on it is a 4. I love this. I know it's dumb, and it's not actually the type of humor that I would typically enjoy, but whatever, I dig it. Its HCS is only a 2.5 though, because it's just like such a cult curiosity at this point that I can't give it any higher. Its current following and the fact that it's an early parody get it to a 2.5, but the fact that it wasn't that successful and didn't launch a single career hold it back. Should you watch it? Definitely, but be aware that it might not be your sense of humor.
Listen, I'm going to kill next at the football game. Click.
Did you hang up?
No, I just said click.
This next one is one that had a contended release date, and it's The Appointment, since some places have its release date as 82, but others have it as 81, but it looks like it at least had a limited run in 81. It kicks off with a young girl being rather dramatically yanked into the woods, and then jumps 3 years, and the Equalizer is here, probably doing things for the greater good. And he has a daughter here, but he's found out that he's going to miss her big violin solo to go on a business trip, and she's extremely disappointed and butts heads with her parents. But that night, the family members are all plagued with horrible dreams, which seem to be more prophecies than anything. And this is just sort of a slow burn, and I'm emphasizing the slow because not a whole lot happens, but it does build up a good deal of atmosphere. It's a British production directed by Lindsay Vickers, and it's his only feature film, although he had a career all through the 70s as an assistant director on a number of horror films. But outside of a couple of producer credits, it seems like this is his last work in the industry. It had a modest budget of around £650,000 and was an attempt to break into the US market. And it's a really odd film. Like, after the jarring intro and setup, it settles into a small domestic drama about dreams. And that portion takes up the entire middle of the film. And then the final act gives us the next day and delves into the realization of that dream being visions of the future or simply nightmares, all accompanied by a low-key and very effective score by Trevor Jones. It was a bit lost in the shuffle when it was released and partially forgotten to the point that it was only available on VHS until fairly recently, although now can be viewed in all its high-resolution glory. And my rating here is a 3. It's a really moody little piece with a lot of great visuals and overall feeling of dread, but I wish there was a bit more meat to this story. Its significance is pretty low at a 1.5 since it's very forgotten and doesn't really feature a lot of horror mainstays, and honestly, there's not even much horror in the movie, but it's enough, and the presence of Woodward gives it a slight boost. Should you watch it? Yeah, particularly if you're a fan of the whole liminal horror thing that's being discussed right now, and that ending is a banger. This next one is another that doesn't have a credited release date, but it did come out at some point in 1981, and it's A Day of Judgment. And we're set back in the 1920s, and there's a priest here leading a church that is only attended by 3 people. He decides to fold up shop and leave town, but gets screwed over by the bank, and there's this cranky old Karen who kills the goat of some local kids, and George here who screws his parents out of their family home, and that night mysterious happenings begin as Mrs. Fitch is dragged down into the ground, and then a mysterious black-clad man starts stalking people with a massive sigh. And the weird thing is that I guess this film is called a slasher flick and carries that description a lot, but as you watch it you realize that, yeah, it's not exactly that. And in fact, based on the sort of little morality plays that it shows you, and the whole setup of this being a town that's abandoned religion, it seems more like a touch of Christian moralizing than anything else. It follows a formula by showing you some of the townspeople just doing something terrible like committing adultery, and then murder, or trying to cheat hardworking farmers out of their land. And then shortly after, the dark stranger strolls in and kills you. The director on this one was Charles Reynolds, and this would be the only film that he ever directed, and with the exception of an acting role as Man in Phone Booth, it was his only credit in the industry whatsoever. It's incredibly slow-paced, and the killer of the film shows up far too rarely in between the little vignettes of sin, ending with a literal sequence of the dead facing hell after being denied redemption. And I mean, if you're wondering if I'm exaggerating this being a Christian film, it ends with a literal prayer up on the screen. And I'm giving this one a 2. It's pretty boring. It's overly long and spends a lot of time just sort of feeling like one of those high school hygiene movies. I kept expecting a voice to come on and be like, now, what did Mrs. Fitch do wrong here? Its significance is only a 1.5 since it's almost all but forgotten. No one's heard of this, and there's no one in it. But I'll give it the extra 0.5 for the oddness of being a weird Christian-themed slasher film. Should you watch it? I'm gonna go with no here. And look, I'm not gonna lie, this block of movies has been killer and may be one of the best rosters I've seen for this whole project. And when I get to add some Fulci to that list, well, I'm a happy man, because on August 14th in Italy, we got The House by the Cemetery. The opening gives us a pretty great couple of deaths, and then we're introduced to Bob. Oh, Bob. So Bob, freaking Bob, and his parents are moving into a new house, because moving is the greatest terror. And his mom is Catriona MacColl, who was Liza in The Beyond, and they arrive at the house after a series of dark omens, including Bob being given a spooky doll. Bob. A mysterious babysitter arrives, and it's Anya Pieroni, who had played the third mother in the beginning of Dario Argento's Inferno. And did you know that when he did Mother of Tears in 2007, he actually asked her to come back to play the part again? But she said no, because by that point she had retired and thought that she was too old to do it. And this movie was considered the third part to Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy. The first part was City of the Living Dead, which is covered in the 1980 project, and the second was The Beyond, which I talked about just a few episodes ago. MacColl features in all three of the films, but plays different characters in each, and in fact, they're not connected in any way except for thematically. The family continue to have odd occurrences around the town as people appear to recognize them, although they've never been there before, and what appears to be a tomb in the floor, and bat attacks. And Fulci claimed that this one was his attempt to do sort of a Lovecraft story without adapting a Lovecraft book. Although personally I feel like City of the Living Dead had more of that, what with the whole Book of Enoch and all. And it's kind of weird because I feel like City and Beyond have way more in common with each other than this one. Like if I had just seen those two, I feel like I could figure that they were linked in some way, but if I saw either of those and this one and you didn't say that they were a thematic trilogy, I don't think I would have assumed that this was part of one. It was also stated by the screenwriter, Dardano Sacchetti, to be a sort of take on the turn of the screw, although Fulci proclaimed to not really care for his script and had it drastically revised. As usual, the amount of violence and gore in the film got him into trouble, and it needed to be cut down in order to get released in Italy as well as the UK, where it ended up on the video nasty list, but was released after cuts were made. It did get a US release, but not until a few years later, in 1984, and critiques at the time were modest, and it got some flack for being more low-key than Fulci's previous efforts, as well as getting comparisons to both Frankenstein and The Shining. The Frankenstein one is pretty apt, considering the secret lab in the basement used to restore a human, named Freudstein even. It was made for 600 million lira, at the time equivalent to about 500,000 American, and made the equivalent of 12 million, which made it Fulci's most profitable film of the 80s. So my rating here is tough, but it's a 3.5. It's not quite a 4. If I had a 3.75 rating, it would be that, because I really dig this one, but not as much as the other two in the trilogy, and it's a touch blander than I like my Fulci flicks. So, whereas I think it's a really enjoyable film, it doesn't quite hit that next level for me. Its significance is a 4 though, because it's Fulci, it's one of the Gates of Hell films, and it's Italian zombies, had some controversy, and is pretty well known. Should you watch it? For Bob's sake, you better.
Wait for me! Under the oak! Okay. No, Bob. Don't go inside. I want you not to.
On the same day, back in the US, Deadly Blessing came out, and this is the first appearance by the legendary Wes Craven on the project. It starts off with Cabby as the head of an Amish-like community, and Lieutenant Athena and her husband, but Knott's Landing Lady is here too, chased by Pluto, who really doesn't want to lose his teaching job. The community is obsessed with Martha being an incubus because she led Jim away from their religion, and young Superman is here too. When Jim is killed in their barn by an unseen person or force, Martha's friends come in to help her out, and one of them is following some sort of a sliver of a basic instinct. The mysterious stalker starts to attack others in the area, seemingly all centered around Martha in one way or another, and this was Craven's first kind of real movie in terms of production level. Like before this, he had only done Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes and an X-rated feature, so this was his first with a real budget and any sort of name actors involved. Wes had compared landing Borgnine for the movie to Carpenter casting Donald Pleasence and said that having him on set made him intimidated and uneasy, since Ernest was a pretty big name at the time. The members of the sect in the movie are called Hittites, which was a biblical group of people and a culture in the Mediterranean area for a few hundred years ago, but the use of them as an American religious community was created exclusively for the film. So, there's several sequences in this film that are pretty notable. The first of them is a bath scene involving Martha that was inspired by a dream that Craven had, and she's in the tub when a snake makes its way into it. And that dream must have really stuck with the guy because he redid this bit a few years later in Nightmare on Elm Street, almost shot for shot. Just replace that big snake with Freddy's glove. Later on in the movie, there's a moment that they felt so strong about that it became the poster for the film, as Sharon Stone's Lana character is in bed, held down by an unseen person, while a tarantula plummets down into her mouth. And that's how you know it's an 80s film. Tarantulas in quicksand, the true dangers of the 80s. Now, this scene is crazy because it's on screen for like half a second. You hardly see it. It would not have been difficult or unconvincing to use a fake spider, but they shot it with an actual spider. Wes tried to convince her to do it before the shoot, but she was very hesitant, and he showed her it was harmless by holding it in his own hands, but I guess that wasn't enough. Now, I don't know how true this story is, but it's all over the place, and I can't find any accounts of anyone directly refuting it, but I'd still take it with a grain of salt. That apparently the only way she would do it is if they removed the spider's fangs. So doing that would mean that the spider would not be able to feed, so it's basically setting it up to starve to death. But it's said that they actually did it anyway and had an operation to remove the spider's fangs. And then afterwards, she did the scene. Now, taking the animal cruelty aspect out of it, I find it a little hard to believe that they were willing to hold up filming to do a medical operation on a spider for a 1-second shot in a $3 million movie at the behest of an unknown actress. I personally am calling BS on the whole spider operation story, but I suppose it's possible. Speaking of Stone, seeing as how this was her very first speaking role, it seems like she took issues with Wes's laid-back directorial style, more focused on setting up shots than giving guidance to his actors, causing her to at one point shout at him, "God damn it, would you direct me?" This one is also known for having not one, but two twist endings, and I'm not going to reveal them here, but one of them would be echoed in another film, a pretty popular slasher flick, just a few years later. The other one, the final shot of the film, is completely out of left field and basically negates and defies everything that came before it. It's really weird and apparently not something that Wes wanted to do. The screenwriter Glenn Benest says that it wasn't in his script and had no idea that it was shot and couldn't believe what he was seeing when it showed up on screen. And it was something that the producers forced Wes to add on in order to end the film on a surprise note. And my rating on this one is a 2.5. There's some things in there that I feel are good concepts, and it certainly sets up some stuff, even if it never really pays any of it off, but it has enough in there to keep my attention, although kind of just barely. Its HCS is a touch higher though at a 3.5, since it's an early work by Craven, shows the genesis of some ideas that he would later elaborate on in his more popular works, has the first big role for Stone, and features Borgnine and Berryman. Should you watch it? Yeah, but be aware that it's not that great, but it's interesting to see Craven's development.
Incubus!
1 week later, we move on to the final movie for this block, and on August 21st, just a few months after the release of The Howling, we got An American Werewolf in London. It gives us two guys on a backpacking trip, and one's a pepper, and the other would prefer to do this after hours, and they make their way to a small village and the Slaughtered Lamb, a pub attended by a bunch of weird folk that include at least one imaginary friend. And let's just take a second here for a little appreciation for Rick Mayall, an underrated comic legend, whether Rick in The Young Ones or Richie on Bottom or even Vim Fuego in Bad News. This guy ruled. They're warned to stay off the roads and off the moors, and if you're an uninformed American like me when you were younger, you didn't really know what the moors were, and they're tracts of open land that are either dry with heather and associated vegetation or wet with an acid peat vegetation, so essentially swampy fields. Well, they don't listen and are attacked by a giant animal that kills Jack and sends David to the hospital, where he's attended by Andy's foster mother, and has weird dreams of both hunting and being hunted by the somewhat out of left field werewolf Nazis. And of course, this was written and directed by John Landis, who had just had huge success with directing both Animal House and The Blues Brothers, and this was a bit of a departure for him. He had a touch of experience with monster stuff with his debut film Schlock, but doing a horror film was a big shift, and he had been sitting on this script for over a decade and really wanted to have it made, and managed to get it greenlit with a budget of anywhere from around $6 million to $10 million, depending upon what report that you believe. David Naughton was cast after Landis saw him in a rather infamous Dr. Pepper ad, and after seeing the amount of nudity and sex involved in this film, he lost his gig with the soda company. And hey, speaking of all that nudity, they had to be a little bit careful when they shot them, because the film reveals David to be Jewish, but the actor himself is not circumcised, so they had to shoot around any revealing shots of the hooded dangler. And then there's that transformation. What can you even say about that? The effects were done by the great Rick Baker, and he and Landis had been friends for ages and had been discussing this film over and over. And Baker had big plans for how to do the metamorphosis, and since it seemed likely that it was never going to happen, when he was approached to do The Howling, he accepted, intending to use what he had devised for that movie. However, when this one was given the go, Landis called Baker and shouted at him for taking on another werewolf project, and convinced him to leave, and Baker turned the reins on that one over to his protege, Rob Bottin. When he made the switch, there were some disagreements with Landis over the work that he was doing. The director wanted a dog-like creature on all fours, requesting a four-legged hound from hell. Baker wanted a biped, much like the howling creatures ended up and how werewolves had been portrayed prior to this. Landis won out, and Baker ended up modeling the creature after his own dog. He was also bummed out by the amount of time that some of his work was on screen. The face stretch, for example, took him months to develop and is only seen for a few seconds, and Baker was frustrated that all of his efforts were for nothing. Until he went to a screening and saw the audience freak out when that scene occurred. And I'm sure that he felt that the work was appreciated when he won an Oscar for it, in the very first ever Academy Award given for Best Makeup. Granted, his only competition was from Heart Beeps, but hey, that was Stan Winston, so it's not like it was some amateur. It got pretty favorable reviews, with most calling it a perfect mix of horror and humor and tons of praise for the effects, even if Roger Ebert, who I said had notoriously uneven views on horror, gave it a middling write-up. It was a pretty big hit, stacking up a worldwide total of around 60 million, and has since become known as one of the greatest werewolf tales of all time. Of course, a sequel did happen, although it took 16 years, with An American Werewolf in Paris, which was both a critical flop as well as a financial one. And talks of a remake have been bandied about for years, and at one time, Landis' son Max was attached to it. But not long after, a long list of sexual improprieties came out, and nothing has been said of it since. And my rating on it is a 4.5. The movie's such a slam dunk and hits so many of the right notes. It's a good balance of being funny without trying to tell jokes, and yet still seeming like a horror film, and has some great characters. Its significance is a full 5, since it's now known as one of the all-time werewolf flicks, innovative transformation effects, and is one of the most known horror film titles out there. Should you watch it? You should, and you should watch it more often, not just on a blue moon.
I didn't mean to call you meatloaf, Jack.
So there you have it. There's that block of films going into the summer of 1981, which is appropriate as we're about to go into the summer here. And my favorite movie from this block is pretty easily An American Werewolf in London. I don't really feel as if this was even close. Although there were a lot of really fun movies in this block. This may have been overall the most enjoyable set of films that I've had to watch for this. I think there was only like one movie in there that I was like, ugh, that was tough to sit through. Almost all the rest of them were enjoyable in one way or another. Let me know your favorite down below. Let me know your favorite from this block and which one of these you haven't seen or which one you've not even heard of. Tell me down below in those comments. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe to get more videos of this coming up. Get the little bell to get notified when those videos come out, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines. You can go there and help support this channel and get more episodes of the 80s Project coming out on a regular basis. And there will be more. There will be lots more because we're only halfway through 1981. We've got a lot more to go right here on the 80s Project.